He's going to talk to you about the Battle of Midway.
Admiral Hoeing, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'll go right into my talk, and when I do, I kind of get on a roll, so please hold your questions till the end. The Pacific Ocean, as many of you in this room know, is the largest geographic feature on Earth. The distances are vast. So when war came to the Pacific in the 1940s, it was a new weapon system, the airplane, and a new type of capital ship, the aircraft carrier, that was able to shrink these distances. There were only 6 carrier versus carrier duels in World War II. Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomon, Santa Cruz, Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, which hardly qualifies because Japan didn't have any airplanes on their decks then. All of these battles are interesting, but there's one that stands out. Midway. And you know the story of Midway. This is where a vastly superior Japanese force was met and defeated by a much smaller American force and turned the tide of the Pacific War. True. But it was also a battle characterized by great intelligent success, almost all on one side. It was a battle characterized by underestimation of the enemy, almost all on one side. And a battle characterized by great valor on both sides. After Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto did indeed run wild in the Pacific. The Philippines fell, Singapore fell, Wake Island. The Japanese attacked Australia. They took the Dutch East Indies at Port Moresby. They took their carrier strike force into the Indian Ocean and defeated the Royal Navy strike group, sinking the carrier Hermes. The Japanese had uncontested command of the Western Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. Meanwhile, all the Americans could do were some hit-and-run raids in the Central Pacific Islands, and these raids didn't really amount to much. But in April 1942, the Doolittle raid, and here's a picture of Jimmy Doolittle taking off in a B-25 Mitchell, medium land-based bomber on a one-way mission to attack Japan and bring the war to the Japanese home islands. This attack shocked the Japanese. And they knew that they had to now husband resources to protect the home islands. And 1 month later at Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history where the ships did not physically see each other, the Japanese advance to cut off the lines of communication to Australia was thwarted by the Americans at a loss of a carrier, and the damage to the carrier Yorktown. But the Japanese could not proceed. The Japanese and Yamamoto and the Japanese Army all agreed that the American carrier force must be put on the bottom. Job one. How to do that? They'd have to take something from the Americans that was important to them. They'd capture Midway, 1,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. Surely the Americans would have to come out and meet them. And once they did, the Japanese would take them under their guns and put them on the bottom and end the American threat to their efforts for a greater empire. It would be just like Tsushima, a battle that Yamamoto participated in, where he lost 2 fingers of his left hand. The American fleet coming under the big Japanese guns, and the Americans would have to sue for peace. While they were at it, the Japanese sent a strike force up to the Aleutian Islands to capture a couple of islands there, Attu and Kiska, and secure their northern flank. Admiral Yamamoto here, in this picture, would be in overall command with Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who led the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, in command of the mobile force. Yorktown limped back from Coral Sea, trailing a slick all the way to the horizon. She went into dry dock here, and the dock masters came to Admiral Nimitz and said, "Sir, it's going to be 3 months before you get the ship back." Nimitz said, "Gentlemen, I need the ship in 3 days." So they got to work. And in 3 days, Yorktown came out of dry dock, patched up, ready to go back into battle and meet her destiny. Deep in the basement of Makalapa Hill at CINCPAC Fleet Headquarters, Commander Joseph Roquefort led the crypto analyst group down there. And these are sailors that perhaps maybe needed a haircut, maybe unkempt uniforms, but they're spending hours and hours a day in painstaking mathematical calculations, and they broke most of the Japanese code. Roquefort and his team took this information to Nimitz's intel officer, Commander Edwin Layton, and the two of them decided that the Japanese were indeed going to attack Midway. They brought this information to Admiral Nimitz, and Nimitz had chartered Commander Layton to be Yamamoto's alter ego. Okay, I want you to tell me what Yamamoto's going to do. So Commander Layton says, well, sir, they're going to attack, Midway, we think, on this time. And Nimitz says, no, I've asked you to be Admiral Yamamoto. Tell me exactly where they're going to be, when. So Commander Layton said, sir, I believe on June 4th we'll find the Japanese from Midway 325, 175 miles at 0600 in the morning. In his memoirs, Layton said he didn't sleep the next 7 nights. Admiral Halsey, through months and months of stress and strain of combat, was not physically able to lead Task Force 16 during this operation. He went to Admiral Nimitz and said, Race Bruins, my cruiser division commander, is the guy you want to lead. And the aviators at Pearl Harbor were incensed. I mean, a black shoe leading Task Force 16? But Nimitz listened to his commander Halsey and said, yes, Admiral Bruins is the guy that I want. The Japanese, for this operation, put together the largest and most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. 11 battleships, including the super battleship Yamato with 18-inch naval rifles. 8 carriers, including Pearl Harbor veterans Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, submarines, auxiliaries of every manner, over 200 ships, the most powerful force the world had ever seen. Facing the most powerful force the world had ever seen, the Americans were able to cobble together 3 carriers, Enterprise, battered Yorktown, and brand new Hornet, which had just been commissioned in the fall of 1941, and had taken the Doolittle Raiders on their mission, and then has come back. Had seen very little combat. 8 cruisers, 18 destroyers, some submarines, and Midway-based air, which was a hodgepodge of Marines flying the Brewster Buffalo fighters, the Vultee Vindicator dive bombers, and we have one right over here, the only one in the world. Ancient, obsolete Vultee Vindicators. TBF Avengers, like this one right here, the Avengers combat debut. Dauntless dive bombers. B-17, strategic, Army Air Corps, B-17, high-altitude bombers. Medium B-26 bombers, fitted with torpedoes, PBY Catalinas. So just a bunch of cats and dogs there, but a fairly formidable land-based force at Midway. This is difficult for you to see in the back. You may be able to get a look on the monitor. But here's the Pacific Ocean. Here is Hawaii. And there's California. That, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty much the Atlantic Ocean, to give you an idea of the distances here. Here's Midway, about 1,000 miles away. The Japanese plan is we're going to attack Midway with our carriers. We're going to beat up the island. The following day, we're going to land troops on Midway, secure the island. Then the Americans are going to come out from Pearl Harbor, and when they do, we're going to pick them off with these submarines right here. And the survivors that get through that are going to be met by Admiral Yamamoto. They're hundreds of miles behind the carriers, and he's going to take them under their guns, cross the T. It's going to be glorious. And there's the, up there in the north, there's the pretty formidable Japanese forces attacking the Aleutian Islands. On June 3rd, a PBY flown by Ensign Jack Reed of VP-44 on a leg 700 miles southwest of Midway found the Japanese invasion force. And he got down low in the water. You can see in this painting, at one point he was closer to Japan than the Japanese were. As he circled the fleet and radioed back to Midway, they're coming, here they are. So that was good news in Makalapa Hill and Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. Okay, we thought this was going to happen, and it looks like it is, exactly. That night, VP-44 went back with a torpedo on a PBY, an aircraft that was not designed to carry a torpedo, with aircrew that had no training to deliver it. They found a Japanese oiler and column. They launched a torpedo, and it hit the ship and went off. This was the first and only successful torpedo attack from the Americans in this battle. On the morning of June 4th, Admiral Nagumo, just like at Pearl Harbor, launched his wave of aircraft in the dark. They took off, and they went in to attack Midway. Not long after that, a PBY flown by Lieutenant Howard Addy, a VP-23 in that northwest search corridor, he radios back to Midway that we sighted the Japanese force on a heading of from Midway 320, 180 miles at 05:55 in the morning. Admiral Nimitz turned to Leighton and said, "Leighton, you were 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." Probably our greatest tactical intelligence success. The Japanese, with 100 airplanes, attacked Midway, and they beat up the island pretty good. They savaged the combat air patrol that the Marines were able to put up with those ancient Brewster Buffaloes and few Wildcats they had, the Japanese Zeros, and there's one right there, ladies and gentlemen, in a left-to-left pass with that Wildcat. Made short work of the Americans. But meanwhile, the Americans were able to, because they were warned, launch the attack aircraft as they went to attack the Japanese fleet. Vindicators like this one, wind indicators, the air crew would call them, were savaged by the Japanese. TBF Avengers, the first combat debut. 6 took off, 1 came back. 16 Marine Corps Dauntlesses from VMSB 241 took off from Midway. 8 returned. 1 aircraft had 200 bullet holes in it. Ladies and gentlemen, that aircraft is right over there. Arguably our most important aircraft here at the National Naval Aviation Museum. None of these aircraft attacks were able to record any hits on the Japanese. But they kept the Japanese off balance. Now, meanwhile, in the bridge of Enterprise, Admiral Spruance got this information where the Japanese were. He turned to his air officer and said, "Launch everything you have at the earliest opportunity." Aboard Hornet was a squadron, Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron from South Dakota. He had 1/8 Sioux blood. He was one of these guys that would just think about tactics. He'd be by himself up in the forward part of the ready room, the JOs in the back, they're playing AC-doocy, and he'd just be thinking about what to do, and then he'd say, "Okay, hey, come on, knock it off, gather around," and he'd talk to his guys about tactics. Think about this. Hornet was commissioned in the fall of 1941. They had a shakedown, the war started. They go through the Panama Canal, they go to San Francisco, they get B-25s. The air wing's not doing much, if any, training here. They deliver the B-25s. They come back, they had a short, very nondescript combat operation in the Central Pacific. Then they were called back to Pearl Harbor for this operation. The air wing, in today's parlance, maybe had 1 test at sea period with which to train before they go into a major combat op. But John Waldron knew that if he talked to his guys about what to do in all cases, he would do the best he could. The TBD Devastator that they flew cruised at 110 knots. To deliver its torpedo, it had to get under 100 knots. This was going to be a tough problem. And here's a picture of John Waldron with his chief, Horace Dobbs, standing in front of their Devastator on the eve of the battle. There's a TBD Devastator pilot and a radioman gunner in back. In 1937, if you're flying Devastators, you are somebody. But by 1942, they are hopelessly obsolete, and John Waldron knew it. On the eve of the battle, he wrote this letter to his squadron, and I'm going to read it to you. "Just to let you know, I feel we are ready. We've had a very short time to train, and we have worked under the most severe of difficulties, but I have truly done the best humanly possible. I actually believe that under these conditions, we are the best in the world. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we don't, and worse comes to worse, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only 1 plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give him help." Can you imagine writing that letter? Knowing what you and your squadron is about to face the next day? Imagine you're a JO or a radioman gunner reading it. Skipper said, "There might only be 1 of us left." George Gay said that Skipper Waldron led them to the Japanese like he had a string tied to him. And when they got there, they were met by 40 Zeros of the CAP of the combined task forces. They savaged VT-8. VT-3 from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lem Massey, and VT-6 of Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Gene Lindsay, also attacked the Japanese that morning. Of the 41 torpedo aircraft that the Americans sent against the Japanese, 6 returned. And 2 of those ditched alongside their carriers when they got back. This is a painting of Ensign George Gay with his radioman gunner, Petty Officer Robert Huntington, dead behind him as the last man left to make a run on a carrier. He launched his torpedo on the carrier Soryu. The ship made a turn. Torpedo missed. George Gay flew over the ship and was shot down by the Zeros on the other side, pancaked in the water, got out of the aircraft, grabbed the seat cushion and hid behind that, and had a ringside seat for what was about to happen. It's probably unfair of me to single out VT-8 when VT-3 and VT-6 also went in to face the Japanese under those tough conditions with those obsolete aircraft. But you look at these names, ladies and gentlemen, and these gentlemen had everything to live for in 1942, and today would be octogenarians among us. But they did their duty, and is an inspiration to those of us affiliated with naval aviation. Nagumo had to make some decisions. He's being attacked by the Midway force. And think about this, ladies and gentlemen. He gets a call from his strike leader. Okay, we beat up the island pretty good, but we got to go back. There's more work to be done. Oh, okay. So now we got to get ready for another strike. Whoa! Look at all these airplanes coming from Midway, and they're coming from all over the place. Close misses. Think about this, guys, and you've been there. The ship is heeling as it's making the turns to avoid these the ordnance being thrown at them. Guys in the hangar bay, they're uploading land-based ordnance. No, wait, we need shipboard ordnance. No, wait, back to land-based. What do? Now there's all these American torpedo aircraft coming at him. There's got to be some more carriers. And then he finally gets a call from one of the scout planes. Yeah, there's an American carrier over here. Whoa, okay, well, actually the Japanese view that as good news. Great, our day of glory will come even earlier. So he decides that he's going to put together a composition of airplanes, 102 airplanes from the forward decks, and he's going to smash the Americans right now. Our day of glory will even come earlier. Now, those of you naval aviation professionals, if you were in the waters northwest of Midway that morning and looking at the tactical situation, you would not have given the Americans much chance to win this battle. Everything launched from Midway has recorded no hits. Most of those airplanes are shot up or shot down. There is not going to be another restrike from Midway that day. American torpedo aircraft and the 3 aircraft carriers virtually wiped out with nothing to show for it. The strike group on Hornet, they're going the wrong way. In fact, all of Hornet's fighters ran out of gas that morning before they could even go back to their ship. Dive bombers on Enterprise and Yorktown are at the end of their fuel legs, and all they see underneath them is water and clouds, another familiar feeling for many of you in this room. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey is CAG on Enterprise. He's leading his group of 32 Dauntlesses. He's at the end of his fuel leg. He's got to make a decision. Do I go back with the ordnance on the aircraft, because I don't see anything down there, but then I haven't done my job? Or do I press ahead, and if I don't find the Japanese, I'm going to run out of gas and we'll lose all 32 airplanes? McCluskey decided to go another 15 minutes. Nimitz called it one of the most important decisions of the war. He goes 15 minutes, and then he makes a turn to the northwest, thinking that he would parallel the Japanese course that he expected for that morning. He looks down between the clouds, and he sees a destroyer, a Japanese destroyer, and follows it, and then leads him to the Japanese mobile force. Wade McCluskey leads his aircraft in aboard against the carrier Kaga. Most of the Enterprise dive bombers attacked that ship. Kaga received 5 hits, pretty much the length of the ship. It turned Kaga into an inferno. This is a painting of Ensign Dusty Kleiss hitting Kaga here, rolling off. You look at that painting, and let me get you well, it's kind of difficult to see. I guess I'll just talk about it. If you can see this image here of the ship from where the island is down to the water line, down to the aft part of the ship. That whole middle part of the ship by the end of the day was gone, as these induced explosions from fully armed to fueled aircraft inside the ship, that was a Japanese doctrine, do all that stuff inside, would just cook off. And then cook off more and more and more. Huge chunks, giant mushroom clouds, eyewitnesses report from Kaga. Akagi was next to her a few miles away. Lieutenant Richard Best put one 1,000-pound bomb in the middle of that ship. And that weapon probably would not have doomed her, but again, ladies and gentlemen, in the hangar bay, all those armed and fueled airplanes, all the land-based bombs, they just kind of pushed off to the side. Not in their magazines, they started cooking off, and within minutes, Akagi's doomed. Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, rolled in on Soryu. The Americans, they didn't coordinate this. The Japanese said splendid was their tactic. In a coordinated manner, they came out of the sun, they came out of the clouds. That part was luck. But it was luck of having a good plan and pressing with their attack. Soryu burned like a blowtorch from both ends, from the 3 hits that the Yorktown inflicted on her. Soryu lost 75% of her crew, of 1,100. Kaga had a crew of 2,400, 800 were lost. Akagi lost a couple of hundred out of her roughly 1,700 crew. There's a scene in the movie Midway, you see it on TNT every now and then. You see the pilots from the carrier Hiryu, and they rush to the deck edge, and they're looking south on the horizon. They see the big black palls of smoke, fuel-fed fires in the distance, and they cannot believe their eyes. This doesn't happen to us. Now, we're the Japanese. We always win. And the Americans can't so much as scratch the paint on our ships. But Yaburo Yamaguchi, quickly, without asking Admiral Nagumo for help, because he's fighting for his life on Akagi, okay, launch, guys, just go, launch. And the Japanese were able to put together a strike force with what they had. They found the carrier Yorktown. They put a bomb in her uptakes, snuffed out her boilers. So she's dead in the water, smoking heavily. The Japanese aviators, as aviators sometimes do, reported a sunk carrier. And so they said, okay, good, well, we got rid of one ship. They put together another strike that afternoon. They had taken heavy losses. They put together another strike that afternoon, and this time they put 2 torpedoes in Yorktown. And Yorktown was in a bad way. But Spruance, that afternoon, was able to put together a counterattack from Hornet and Enterprise and put 4 hits in Hiryu. I think we have a picture of that. If you can see this picture taken on June 5th, that's Hiryu's upper and lower hangar bay. The entire flight deck of the bow is blown off. The elevator is blown off against the island structure there. Hiryu went under not long after that picture was taken. So Japanese carrier air power is now virtually wiped out. Admiral Nagumo wanted to salvage something from this, so he's taken his battleships and the cruisers, what he had, and he thought he could attack the Americans that night, and the Japanese would have won that battle at night. They had superior equipment and sensors. Spruance, wisely, retired to the east, and they got to the point where the Japanese had to go to the west, and Yamamoto said, okay, let's face reality, we're done. The Americans were able to capture a couple of Japanese cruisers that were limping back to Japan and sink one of them. Okay. Now here's Yorktown. I think people can see that's a pretty heavy list. I think that's if that isn't 30 degrees, it's pretty close. Yorktown floated through the 5th and 6th, and they were going to tow her back to Pearl Harbor and thought they could salvage her. But a Japanese submarine I-58 got in among the American screen, put a torpedo into the destroyer Hammond, which is alongside providing power, blew that ship in 2, sank within minutes. And now Yorktown takes one at the turn of her bilge, and this one doomed Yorktown. Amazingly, Yorktown floated through the night, but on the morning of June 7th, with battle flags flying, she rolled over on her port side and fell 18,000 feet to the bottom, where she sits today, sitting upright and largely intact. The Americans lost Yorktown, Hammond, 300 aviators, 150 some aircraft. These are serious losses. But compared to the Japanese, those 4 irreplaceable carriers that took years and years to build, and those thousands of trained technicians that knew how to operate that weapon system, not so much pilots. Think about the mechanics, the armorers, all the people on those ships that were gone forever. Japan never recovered from this and was on the defensive for the next 3 long years of bloody attrition warfare. Lessons learned. A victory of intelligence, to be certain. And the Japanese, they kind of soft-pedaled the intelligence. They had a plan to scout Pearl Harbor. It didn't happen. They just kind of, no, okay. The Americans are there. Or the Americans are afraid. They kind of, reading their own press clippings. They dispersed their forces literally across the Pacific Ocean. There was no way there was any mutual support. The Aleutians force, pretty formidable force. They were days and days steaming away. Even Yamamoto behind in the battleship line, that was at least 2 days away from where he needed to be. And ladies and gentlemen, the battleship emphasis, and the Japanese knew better. They had just rewritten the book on naval history 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. But they still thought the battleship was the weapon of choice they wanted to use in that battle. They didn't have any radar. And radar was around. The Japanese had been paying attention to the Battle of Britain in 1940. They knew about radar, and they had a radar set, actually. And they put this radar set on a battleship, which was hundreds and hundreds of miles from where it needed to be that morning. The Japanese lost sight of what their central goal was. It wasn't to attack Midway on some artificial timeline. It wasn't to take a couple of worthless islands in the Aleutians. It was to put the American carriers on the bottom. They lost sight of that. Talked about the poor reconnaissance plan, which was a dearth to their intelligence. But the final big takeaway here, and for those of you on active duty at any rank need to know and remember this, the Japanese scripted it. The Americans will do this, then this, then this, then this. Doesn't work that way in warfare, does it? Doesn't work that way in business or sports or really any human activity. And Japanese paid the price for it. They didn't think about what the Americans could do or were capable of doing. Admiral Spruance went on to 4 stars. He commanded the fleet at the Battle of Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the amphibious landings at Saipan and Tinian. He then became the ambassador to the Philippines and finished his career as the ambassador to the United Nations. He retired to his home in Carmel, California, and passed away in 1969. Arguably our greatest fighting admiral. Hornet met her end in October of 1942 at Santa Cruz. The Japanese were able to put a torpedo in her and bomb her. They tried to salvage her, but the Japanese were approaching, and the fleet commander made a decision, no, the rest of us have to go. So they tried to scuttle her. She still floated. The Japanese came upon her that night, burning from stem to stern, and were only too happy to give the desecrator of Nippon the coup de grace. Hornet was in commission for 1 year. Enterprise survived the war. It was decommissioned in 1946, and despite the efforts of people like Halsey and Nimitz to save her as a museum, she was broken up in 1959. Yamamoto met his end in 1943 over the Solomons, again, through superior intelligence. President Roosevelt was given information that he was going to be flying down to Rabaul. He authorized Army P-38s to shoot down that aircraft. The Japanese combined fleet at the end of Midway was still superior to the Americans in every class of vessel. But as we talked about earlier, over the next 3 years of attrition warfare, it was ground down to nothing by an avalanche of American steel. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a takeaway that what we have to think about in this battle. What if we had lost? What if we had lost this battle? Because the Japanese attacked us in 1942, and the American people wanted us to deal with the Japanese. If we had lost this battle, certainly we would have had to put resources in the Western Pacific. And if we had put those resources in the Western Pacific, they wouldn't have been in North Africa in the fall of 1942, Operation Torch against the Germans. And if the Germans didn't have to deal with us there in 1942, then maybe they would have had enough resources to defeat the Soviets at places like Kursk and Stalingrad, which are pretty close-run battles. But the Soviets, of course, did prevail. And had the Americans still not been able to win this battle with resources in the Pacific, would we have been able to muster the strength that we had in June of 1944 at D-Day? Maybe not. And if not, what would have stopped the Soviets from going through Germany and the Low Countries and maybe even into France? Wouldn't have been there to stop it. The world would look different, wouldn't it? And this is, I'm going to give credit to this to former SecDef James Schlesinger, who gave a speech at the Army-Navy Country Club to this effect. Battle of Salome in 480 BC. This is a year after the battle at Thermopylae, the 300, you've seen the movie several years ago. This was the naval battle where King Xerxes of Persia was up on the hill, and he's going to watch his Persian fleet crush the Greeks to take over the Greek peninsula. The Greeks, through an inferior numbers but greater skill, were able to prevail and thwart the Persian entrance into Greece. Think about that. Greece, which is the birthplace, the cradle, if you will, of Western civilization, the tenets of human rights, personal property rights, civilian audit of leadership, a capitalist system, one man, one vote, simply liberal democracy, if you will. Another point made by SecDef Schlesinger would have been snuffed out, in his words, by Oriental despotism, and the world would probably look different. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why Midway is a pivotal battle on world history, and we need to think about it and remember it. I first gave this talk in Ready 3 aboard USS Enterprise. We're going on deployment. We're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I called the officers into the ready room. Okay, guys, we're going to meet about 10 o'clock at night, and so I give my talk. At the end, I said, okay, are there any questions? And there were none, because everyone wanted to go to Midrats. And I said, all right, no one leaves till I get 3 questions, which I quickly got. And the JOs were able to go to Midrats, and happy ending. I am in no position to demand questions of any of you here, but if you have any, I'd be happy to take them. Sir Admiral.
Kevin, what were the questions?
I do remember one question, and one of the questions was, what books do you use? How did you research this, Skipper? And there's a lot of great books out there. The First Team by John Lundstrom. Shattered Sword came out after I gave my first talk. It was a wonderful, wonderful book. Nimitz by E.B. Potter is a great one. The Ship That Held the Line, story of USS Hornet. Yeah, there's a lot of great material. Another one, And I Was There by Edwin Layton. Sir. I'm sorry, sir, I can't hear you. There's a microphone right there.
Is there any truth to the water distilling plant on Midway, and they sent a fake AF a message and it responded, and they found out that the Japanese did in fact, or they found out about the code? Is that a true happening?
Yes, sir, it is true, but maybe not. And the question is, how about that water distillation plant that they, that Nimitz and his crew said, we want you to tell you, send us a radio message that the water distillation plant is out. And then not long after that, the Japanese radioed to their headquarters in Tokyo, Midway's AF's water distillation plant is out. That was used to prove to the guys in Washington who thought they knew better that the Japanese were really going to go to Midway. Admiral King in Washington said, no, Chester, they're not going to be at Midway. Don't commit your forces. So Admiral Nimitz and Roquefort and Layton said, let's send this message and see what happens. And once they did, they were able to go back, see? Sir.
Because of the extended time that before the Yorktown sank, how orderly was the abandoned ship, and how was that? Had that been planned, not for the Yorktown, but generally during general quarter drills, and were there sufficient ships to take those people out of the water and so on?
Yes, sir. The question is, how orderly was the abandoned ship? The abandoned ship order was given on the afternoon of the 4th, not long after she was torpedoed the first time. The ship took a heavy port list. She had been damaged earlier. The crew came off in an orderly manner. There were many escort destroyers nearby. But the next day, she's still floating, so they sent a damage control party back aboard to include Captain Buckmaster to salvage her, and they were making headway. And they probably would have towed her back to Pearl Harbor, which was a ways, and given good conditions, they could have done that until the Japanese destroyer got in there. Yes, sir.
What role did Admiral Mitchell play? Did he come in later?
Admiral Mitchell was CEO of USS Hornet at the time, and Hornet had a bad day on June 4th. Hornet's air wing did not perform well, and it's easy to say, well, those guys didn't know what they were doing. But again, I mean, many of us here in this room realize, how much training did those guys get really? And they had virtually no combat experience and very little training to begin with. So it was difficult. There were difficult decisions made on the bridge of Hornet, and you go back for the debrief and you Monday morning quarterback, and there were mistakes made. And the Americans quickly learned from their mistakes because of the high price they had to pay. Yes, sir. The question, sir? The Americans had wooden decks. They were not armored. So a bomb would go off in the wooden decks, and there'd be wooden splinters everywhere. But the good news is they could be quickly repaired, and they were repaired. Depending on the damage, we're talking tens of minutes, an hour or so.
Seems there's always been some controversy over the loss of all the torpedo planes. Wasn't there some decision made as to the fighter cover that was supposed to accompany the torpedo squadrons on in, and they didn't hook up, or there was none sent, or something like that?
There was the Navy and Marine Corps, maybe the Americans at the time, had poor radios. So radio communication was spotty. Guys in the ready rooms would make deals. Okay, we're going to fly at this altitude. You fly at this altitude. There was speed differential with these aircraft as well. The goal was, let's let the slower torpedo guys get out front, and the fighter guys can catch them and not expend so much gas. Some decisions were made on some ships that were 180 out, bad decisions. Others were, hey, when we get attacked, we're going to say, we need your help. Come on down. And torpedo bomber pilots would be screaming for help, begging for help, not heard by the fighters. Some of those transmissions were heard by dive bombers that were all over the place. So difficult time, and again, in today's experience with, we are used to radios that work and sensors and all that coordination. They didn't have any of that.
What's the
I think, yes,
what's
sir.
the Japanese perspective on the war, on Battle of Midway after the war? Do they view it as pivotal as we do here?
Mitsuo Fushida wrote a book, Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan. And Fushida was the CAG that led the Pearl Harbor raid. And Fushida had an appendicitis on the eve of Midway, so he was not able to participate. He was tasked after the battle to do an after-action report, if you will. He saved his notes. And once the war ended, I think around 1950 or so, he published his book. And his book has flaws that Parshall and Tully in Shattered Sword point out, rightfully. But it's basically, it's fate. We had fully loaded decks. We knew where the Americans were. We're turning into the wind. We're launching airplanes. And then they come out of the sky. We were just that close. That wasn't necessarily true. But the Japanese, that was kind of the narrative. And who was to deny Mitsuo Fushida? He was an eyewitness. He was there. American commentators and historians depended on him a great deal in subsequent years until Parshall and Tully went to Japan. They found the records. There's still some veterans of Midway in Japan, and they set the record straight. It's a wonderful book, Shattered Sword, if you haven't read it. Ladies and gentlemen, one more question, and yes, sir. That's you. What was the question, sir? At Midway, they had 4. There were 4. Now, there were 2 up in the Aleutians, and then they had a couple of escort carriers that were not much more than Langley that are tagging along and doing maybe some CAPT duties, if that. But 4 fleet carriers that were at Midway. And last question. Yes, sir.
Weren't the Zeros called down to take on the Devastators, and that's why they weren't at altitude when McCluskey came over with his Dauntlesses?
Yes, and this is kind of a myth about Midway. The Zeros were down in the water and they're shooting down Devastators, which they did to great effect. And then the dive bombers were able to come in. Waldron got to the Japanese an hour and 10 minutes before McCluskey did. So that's plenty of time for the Japanese to reset the cap. You can even land and recover those airplanes, maybe even do a quick turn. Certainly you get another cap airborne in that time. But at the time McCluskey and Leslie were rolling in, VT-6 was down there in among the Japanese, still finishing their attack. So it was just a cycle of aircraft throughout that morning. It's not complete to say that the torpedo aircraft alone brought the cap down to the water. It did a little, but that wasn't the only reason. I'll add one more thing, and then I'll move on to the next, ladies and gentlemen. The Japanese didn't have radar. They didn't really have fighter direction. What the Japanese cap would do, they would circle overhead the force, and that was their job, and they would look at screening ships, and the screening ships would see airplanes coming in, and with their main battery, they would launch a broadside in that direction. So you're a pilot, and you see a flash down there. Okay, there it is, and you kind of look up, and that was early warning for those guys. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to now turn it over to Captain Rich Dan, because there was another battle going